Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other this morning on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people who are with us here this morning. Good morning for a very special scholar talk here in the middle of NAIDOC week. So the first full week of July every year is dedicated to the celebration of First Nations people, their histories, their cultures, their lives, and today here at the library, their achievements as well. This year's theme is Get Up, Stand Up, Show Up, arguing for systematic change across Australia. Do go to nadoc.org.au for a full round of events that's happening here in New South Wales and right across the country. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Kathy Bowrey, who will be delivering today's scholar talk on David Unaipon, the man who graces our $50 note. Kathy is a professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of New South Wales, a legal historian who has published extraordinarily widely, almost intimidatingly so. She's a leading legal figure in the field of knowledge creation and who gets to own what. She is, of course, a visiting scholar here at the library. It's great to have her here today to share her research with us. If you have any questions of Kathy about today's talk or her field more broadly, please use the chat feature in Zoom, and I'll be back in a little while to ask those questions for you. Thanks so much, Kathy.
Thanks, Rachel. So today I'm speaking from the lands of the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, and I acknowledge the elders past, present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. The slide that's on the screen that you can see now is from the Coorong, South Australia, and I'll be talking about matters that occurred on Narrandjeri lands, primarily related to the Port Macleay mission, which today is called Ruakar. So for those of us like me who grew up in Australia, we learn about Aboriginal Australia from accounts that have often been produced without much Aboriginal engagement or in collaboration. There's an awful lot that's already been written about David Unaipon, and in particular his patented shearing invention of 1909. The accounts include entries published in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, at IATSIS, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and the Reserve Bank of Australia. An important aspect of decolonizing national stories about Aboriginal Australia is where non-Aboriginal researchers use their expertise to respond to questions that Aboriginal people want explored. So my fellowship at the State Library of New South Wales and the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, which led to the paper I'm giving today, came about because of an encounter I had with a descendant of David Unaipon, Kinr. And I'm very grateful to the State Library and to the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences for their support and help with accessing their collections to progress this research. I'm going to let him introduce himself and the context that set up this research. The video I'll play runs for about 10 minutes. It's only very lightly edited so that Kim's voice is not distorted. And mainly that was to cut out aircraft noise. I hope that you can hear him okay. You might need to tweak your settings on your own personal computers if you're having difficulty hearing from Kim.
Okay, yeah. My name is Kinr, and I was born on Point Macleay Aboriginal Reserve. That's down in the south at the end of the Murray River. And when I lived on Point Macleay Mission, I lived just down the hill from these people called Unaipons, David Unaipon and Creighton Unaipon and Tolly Unaipon and what's his name, the other guy? Telford Unaipon, who was my grandfather, and I can't even remember his name. Wow. And I would often visit them nearly every day from when I got to know them. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I would spend nearly every day going up to their house and sitting there they're listening to them and listening to what they're talking about. And it's unusual at that time because they usually didn't let little kids in, but I was lucky, so I got to hear a lot of things. Uncle Banks Long used to live there too at the time, and he was the guy that was even able to tell us our future. So what an amazing people they were. These old people were absolutely brilliant in every way, and I owe my life to them. I owe everything that ever happened to me to them. And I became interested in David Unaipon more later in life when I discovered that he invented a cutting mechanism for the sheep shearing machine back in 1909. And I didn't know about this until I was about 23 years old or a bit more. Me and my brother-in-law were working in a shearing shed, and he said to me, "See this here?" He was a shearer, and I was just a shed hand. And he said, "This mechanism works from the brain of your great-grandfather. He invented that. He invented how it cuts." He said, from circular all the way along the shed, you can see that shaft is spinning in a circular motion all the way along till it gets to the shearing handpiece, where it cuts in a straight line motion. Then, so what an invention! And that's how I found out, and I became interested ever since about whatever happened to the handpiece, whatever happened to the cutting mechanism that. But I found out later that it was taken from him and sold onward to somebody else, and they made money out of it and whatever. So money's not the big push here. I can make enough money for my own self without worrying about all these other things, but it's just fascinating to know what happened and how it happened and who it was, because the who is still not produced even today, but we know about all the other things. So it's an ongoing quest, and whether in my lifetime I'll find out, I don't know. Probably depending on the written stuff about Unaipon is depending on who the writer is, because a lot of times they'll say such wonderful things like, oh, he is a genius, he was a Da Vinci, he was this, he was that. But other times, other people will say, well, he didn't go to England, or he didn't go here, he didn't do that, he never went there, he wasn't a minister. All these type of things. I'm not really angry or feel disappointed that people have said what they said about him. I mean, because nobody really knew Unaipon. I mean, I'm probably the only person alive today who knew him or saw him or heard him. I mean, so, and even I don't know everything about Unaipon. But the thing is, it's just interesting that in the latter years, they're trying to say now that he didn't invent anything. They're saying you'll never find any kind of proof of the stuff that he invented, or because they were thrown away years and years ago. And but wow, are they in for a shock? It's just been a fascinating journey through all of Unaipon's life, and thinking about, how it all panned out in the end. People think that, I'm looking for money. Like I said, I've been able to make my own money, and as you can see around me, I paint these pictures, and they're for sale. And yes, by myself, I know just writing the biography of Unaipon is a bit maddening, because it sends me into all kinds of feelings too when I write about him and think about all the things what happened. It's been very tricky for me even in my lifetime, because if you say something, other people will want a piece of you, or if people are so thin-skinned about their parts in life, but they forget poor old Unaipon had nothing. He lived on the border of starvation all his life. Nobody really cared about him. I mean, they were his friends, of course, when he had these inventions up and going. They used to take him around in cars and drive him around and talk all kinds of things and want to look at his invention. And they did the same thing to his perpetual motion invention. They would try to pull it apart and rejig it, and these people didn't know nothing about what Unaipon was doing, Unbelievable. See, these things need to be said. These things will be said in my book. I'll write about what these type of idiots were trying to do, So it's all there. I've been lucky enough to meet a lovely person who's helped me through the last few years, that I wouldn't have known what to do next, because I didn't believe that there was any of his inventions still around, still recorded, and that's what we needed, to record everything anyway in such a way, because like we said, nobody knows anything about Unaipon. Even for me myself, he was a quiet kind of man. He was a gentleman, but I feel that he was just taken for a ride. That's my own thoughts.
Okay, so today I'm going to focus on these three questions. What actually happened with his patent applications? Was he taken for a ride? And why is history, which really should matter still to us today? So David Unaipon had been researching the problem of perpetual motion and experimenting for years before the shearing invention was patented. Now, from a European perspective, a fascination with perpetual motion dates from the 16th century and Renaissance ideas about genesis, metamorphosis, transformation, and creation. Over the centuries, many machines were created that sought to demonstrate endless motion without any external source of energy or ways of harnessing and converting energy, ignoring the practical realities of resistance, things like friction, and other sources of energy loss. There's such a long history of patents for perpetual motion that there's actually an international class that is set aside for it. We now understand why perpetuation can't be achieved. The idea is contrary to fundamental laws of thermodynamics, but not all patents for perpetual motion or conversion of motion were useless. There are still perpetual motions patents which are being filed today, and in some cases they're still granted. In the process of research and investigation, there are other discoveries that can be made. So the shearing invention of 1909 was the first invention for which any patent was sought. There had been a shearing enterprise at Point McClellan Mission since the 1880s, and the mission was run by the Aboriginal Friends Association. Wool washing in Alexandrina and wool sales were an important source of income for the mission. and there's records extolling the technical innovations that were introduced by Aboriginal people in that enterprise. The wool usually came from neighbouring pastoralists, but in 1907, when the wool price was very high, the mission got a government grant to improve buildings, and from then on, shearing begins on site. This newspaper report says that David Unaipon described a perpetual motion concept to the first professor of engineering appointed at Adelaide University in 1907, who was also the professor of mathematics and mechanics in 1910, a man called Professor Chapman. The professor advises him to apply his ideas to a machine. So shearing machinery is something that David Unaipon would have been familiar with and had ready access to. He alters the hand piece mechanism and works out how to convert rotary motion into a straight line movement. It improved efficiencies because it allowed for a closer cut with more control, and it also had occupational health efforts because it blew dust and grime downwards rather than up into the shifts. Before Chapman became an academic, he worked in railway construction, and it's more than possible that Professor Chapman put David Unaipon into contact with the man who would become his patent attorney, a man called Mr J. Herbert Cook. Obviously, if you're interested in commercialising a patent, you need a good patent attorney. So J. Herbert Cook was himself a mechanical engineer and a draftsman who worked for the South Australian Government Engineering Works, or the railways, at the same time as Chapman. And he trained as consultant engineer in Adelaide and became a patent attorney in 1893. Cook sold several editions of a booklet that he produced that explained how to achieve a patent, and he had advertised it to sale through the newspapers. He became the vice president of the Australian Institute of Patent Attorneys in 1907, the year that the Federal Patent Act comes into operation. He'd go on to be a president and a member of the Federal Board of Patent Examiners. So it should be assumed that David Unaipon had received the best available legal advice whilst Cook was alive. Cook himself had political ambitions. He was an unsuccessful free trade candidate from the first federal parliament, where he campaigned for, amongst other things, federal patent law. He went on to be a later a Liberal member for the South Australian Legislative Council in 1915 to 1933, where he mainly served on the Railway Standing Committee. His parliamentary service included inquiries into the grievances of the Point Macleay Mission in 1926. This came about from a petition that was signed by 51 people who lived on the mission. David Unaipon was involved in the organisation of this and in the running of the subsequent government inquiry. I will talk about some other things that happened to David Unaipon in 1926 in a short while. But just briefly now, the complaints concerned the very poor living conditions on the mission, but also the arbitrary behaviour of the mission superintendent and of the police. One example of the complaints includes the superintendent of the mission arranging for David Unaipon's arrest for vagrancy. David was at the mission visiting his elderly mother, and he refused to accept demeaning work which was allocated to him by the superintendent, and he also refused to give the superintendent his research and writings or details about to whom he was writing about the mission to. The complaints, which were mainly about housing and arbitrary punishments, included the way that the police were called onto the mission for trivial disputes, but not being called on also for more serious issues of violence. The report was conducted by two Liberal MLCs and the Secretary of the Aboriginal Friends Association. They recommended that the superintendent of the Point Macleay mission be dismissed. They also called the treatment of David Unaipon harassment. But as the report was received by a Labor government, nothing actually happened. Cook appears to have been a very reliable ally and supporter of David Unaipon throughout Cook's life. This is on the screen is the first reference to the Aboriginal Friends Association report for 1909, and it's interesting to me because it provides an insight into what was the original patenting strategy. One of the main tests for the grant of an exclusive monopoly right is that the invention needs to be new or a novel invention. The inventor gets a private monopoly to exploit the patent for a set term of years only if the invention has previously been kept secret. In that way, in return for full published disclosure of how the invention works, the inventor gets a monopoly right that allows for exploitation of the patent for a set term of years. But if you start showing around an invention, demonstrating it or having it tested, the patent is taken as already having been made public, and there's no longer any justification for awarding a patent grant. So Cook's idea was to lodge a provisional application for a patent and go see what the world thought of this invention. I'll draw your attention to the last line on the screen because it is a matter that really affects what happens to David Unaipon's capacity to work during the first decades of the 20th century. The report says, the fact that a full native has thus shown original talent is proof that the Aborigine has latent brain power, which by judicious teaching and training may develop in unexpected ways. Now, one of the things the State Library has is an interesting collection that dates from 1939 called the Model School Library. It's a list of about 2,000 titles, which were consideration for what would make a good collection by school librarian for school librarians. It's a great social history resource. The collection includes subject matter today that we call science and technology studies, engineering, anthropology and social science, economics. These books frequently refer to the history of technological and scientific progress, to machines, inventors and inventions. Aboriginal Australians exclusively feature in these narratives at the pre-scientific end. Because of this prevailing view, where there's evidence that an Aboriginal person is engaged with cutting-edge physics and sophisticated mechanics, this creates a significant conundrum. There's far more interest and discussion about this than there is in the invention itself. And this form of racism has continual repercussions for David Unaipon. Unaipon's shearing invention is granted in 1909, and at this time, the patent is initially granted for 7 years. It costs £1 to lodge the provisional application, £2 on acceptance of the complete specification, £5 for sealing the patent when the patent is formally granted and published, and then there's after 7 years, there's a renewal fee of £5 that needs to be paid. Australia, like Britain, was a member of the International Convention on Industrial Property from 1853. It was possible to file a British patent by making an application in the usual manner in the United Kingdom within 12 months of the original Australian filing. British patent could have to change but no application was made. It is most likely that Cook, and indeed all the Australian patent attorneys of this period, lacked links to the British Patent Office. After the Federation, Australian patent attorneys were preoccupied with extending their businesses into other states of Australia and into the Pacific. While no patent application was filed in the UK, the Australian specification was published in the UK, which meant that British and American firms could commercialise the invention even whilst it was valid in Australia. The Australian shearing patent lapsed in September 1916 because there's no renewal payment of the fee. It was possible to allow for an enlargement of time to pay this fee, which was calculated by a month, and you could also restore a patent that had lapsed due to non-payment of fees. In other words, the Patent Office gave time to the applicant to make amends, but this patent was advertised as void at the end of 1917. Whilst we don't have any records or interviews with Cook, it's very likely that renewal fees would have been paid if there were any commercial prospects at the time. Cook went on to lodge all of David Unaipon's patent applications, and the filing ends at the time of Cook's death in 1943. A few observations about the filings that you might see on the screen here. These won't be the only inventions that David Unaipon was involved in. It's probably impossible to accurately account for them all. But there is documentation about these 10 because Cook's filed provisional specifications, and these provisional specifications were all accepted by the Patent Office. There were 9 and probably 10 patent filings, but only one patent was ever granted, and it lapsed, as I said, at the end of the first 7 years. There's a 1927 invention for a multi-radial wheel, which is recorded by a T. Unaipon. Now, that could be correct since there were 2 T. Unaipons on the mission, but there's also a reference to it being a David Unaipon invention in the files of the Office of the Chief Protector. Mostly, the class of filing relates to what was called conversion of motion, transferring motion, or propulsion. As a researcher, David Unaipon is mainly interested in exploring practical applications of Newtonian physics and applying those ideas to improve existing machinery. There's no full details of the technical specifications of anything other than the shearing invention because the full patent specifications were never filed. The fact that there are two co-inventors listed on the application and an assignment of one to a person else, another person, corroborates Kim's story that whilst he was following his own interests, people were also approaching David Unaipon to solve their technical problems and knew very well about his technical and research expertise. Okay, so was he taken for a ride? This image is of David Unaipon was on the previously issued and first polymer $50 note, and you can see the technical drawing of the shearing invention on the right. In 2018, the Reserve Bank reissued the $50 note, but removed the patent information or reference to David Unaipon as an inventor. The current one has instead a focus on ethnographic details. So to work out if he was ripped off, there's a need to consult the collection at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences because they have a large collection of shearing and wool-related artefacts and some company files for Cooper Engineering. This company becomes Sunbeam, and family history think that it was Sunbeam who ripped off the invention. The collection also had technical analyses. So William Cooper and Nephews, Cooper Engineering are Australian firms connected to a British multinational. Cooper's empire grew in the 19th century from a patented sheep dip, which was largely a firm that produced toxic chemicals with veterinary uses. They also had a business association with the US company called Chicago Flexible Shaft Company, which made cutting tools. Sunbeam is the successor company. There's also a law collection in the United Kingdom, which has a larger archive of these co associations, with the material I consulted on their role of pastoralism and the role of the Australasian branches of the firm. I also obtained the shearing-related patent specifications filed by Cooper Engineering and Chicago Flexible Shaft in the 1920s. The most interesting finding is this observation. In 2007, the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences invited a museum volunteer, Professor Svensson, who was a former head of School of Mechanics and Engineering at the University of New South Wales, and he reviewed the collection of mechanical sheep shearing and pieces used rotary cutters as seemed to be the most appropriate concept. These were, however, replaced by oscillatory motion, which is now universal. The reference to oscillatory motion as an industry standard is in fact a reference to the Unaipon invention of oscillatory motion. But in terms of whether this means he was ripped off for the shearing invention, there are two considerations. First, once the patent lapsed in 1917, anyone could legally use the invention in Australia, and it was always able to be used anywhere in the world without infringing, apart from a small window of opportunity in 1909 to 1910, when it would have been possible to achieve a patent in other convention countries. So legally, no, there's no evidence the patent itself was infringed. But of course, this doesn't mean he wasn't ripped off. Second, there were considerable obstacles to commercialising the patent because David Unaipon's legal status as an Aboriginal Australian. This really created impossible circumstances for him personally. But it also created additional legal complications for any non-Aboriginal people if they wanted to commercialise this or any other of his inventions. This is a really important issue, and that's what I'm going to turn to now. Okay, so what was the legal status of an Aboriginal invention? Until 1916, when it was taken over by the state government, Aboriginal people living at the Point Macleay mission were under the direct control of the mission superintendent. There were regulations that governed the community and set the priorities, which related to schooling and religion, allocation of work, permission to leave work, and power to expel people from the community. In 1911, the Aboriginal Act is passed in South Australia, and this makes the Chief Protector of South Australia the legal guardian of every Aboriginal. On the mission, the superintendent's power now has to be exercised in conjunction with the authority of the Chief Protector. This involved a significant change in the legal status of David Unaipon, impacted on his property rights. It actually removed his right to enter into binding contracts, it affected his right to raise finance and his capacity to give evidence in legal proceedings. Under the Patents Act of 1903, David Unaipon was eligible to apply for and be named as an inventor. But once the patent is granted, It is the chief protector who will become the trustee of the property interest. In other words, it's really only the chief protector who's entitled to license or assign patent rights or deal with David Unaipon's property. There are other more practical limitations as well. Section 17 of the Aboriginals Act 1911 permits the Chief Protector to contain Aboriginal persons on reserves and mission and to be subject to the rule of the governing body. Under 19B, a permit was required whenever David Unaipon sought to leave the Point Macleay mission. Even where he is approved to move around, there's still a matter of how he gets funds to do any travel. So this is an example of an index card which listed approved railway and steamer fares from the mission that were paid to David Unaipon. One of the main sources of income that he could independently generate was from touring and public speaking for various church organisations, where he also advocated for Aboriginal rights. There's a lot of discussion of this aspect of his work. If he asked for it, it seems that often money would be advanced for that. And in some accounts, David Unaipon is referred to as an employee of the Aboriginal Friends Association, but he was not. But when David asked for money or financial support for the inventions or to pursue opportunities to try and commercialise his inventions, this is simply not forthcoming. Let me give you some examples. His second invention in 1913, he's in Adelaide, and he shows his invention of an engine invented with a F. Russell to the government mechanical engineer in charge of railways. The chief engineer's view is that it's not going to be useful for very, very large engines like trains. He doesn't say it's not useful. He doesn't say it's not important. David Unaipon tells the Friends Association that he's in urgent need of money and seeks some financial support so he can go and see if others might be interested in exploiting this invention. The Friends Association's response is that he should solicit donations or subscriptions to the Aboriginal Friends Association, and if he does that, he can keep 10% of the income he makes for them. So I looked at how much money that could possibly have been, and it was an extraordinarily modest amount of money that could have been earned by that type of enterprise. The patent application lapses. The next patent application is in 1915 for an instrument for transferring motion. There's another request for assistance to see if he can gather any commercial interest. There's no support available because this is not what the Aboriginal Friends Association do. They're a religious organisation. This application also lapses. In terms of the next four inventions in the 1920s, again, support is needed to get it solicited commercial interest. In 1925, there's a discussion with John Sexton, who's the Honorary Secretary of the Aboriginal Friends Association, and Professor Wood Jones about how to better support David Unaipon. But what they end up suggesting has nothing to do with supporting his inventions. Wood Jones was Professor of Anatomy in London in 1912 and joined Adelaide University in 1919. He specialised in marsupials. In 1926, he's elected President of the Royal Society of South Australia, and he's also head of the South Australian Museum Committees. Here he is introducing koalas to Kangaroo Island. The Bulletin reports in 1925 that Wood Jones, along with other members of the Royal Society, had, quote, formed a committee to finance David Unaipon to enable him to devote his life to studying the customs of his own people. It's thought that he will be simply invaluable as a go-between, having totem and other rights which outsiders will only get as a compliment, if at all. In press reports at this time, David Wood Jones jokingly referred to as his old game of measuring human cranium. So David Unaipon is sought out to provide assistance in extracting knowledge and artefacts from other Aboriginal people. He's not given support for his own agendas. Nothing comes from this so-called opportunity, but then another option is pursued. Through the efforts of John Sexton, there's an initiative to employ David Unaipon as an attendant at the South Australian Museum, where he could help with Aboriginal exhibits, give talks on weekends about Aboriginal artefacts in the collection, and also talk about Aboriginal culture. If he had been employed as attendant, he would have earned £224 a year. A cleaner earned £76 a year. This idea was actually first approved by the museum, who then sent it to the Finance Committee, but then it's kicked from meeting to meeting to meeting. And in July 1926, Wood Jones agreed for it to be dropped. 1926, of course, is also where there is the other issues happening at the Point Macleay mission. In 1927, there's a report that he'd sought a loan to advance his invention of a multi-radial wheel. It was also denied, and this account is recorded by the Chief Protector of Aboriginals. The reason it will be in the Chief Protector's reports is probably due to the Aboriginals Act, because it was the Chief Protector who needed to take out the loan. David Unaipon had no legal capacity to borrow money from a bank. This event relates to the patent that's recorded for a T Unaipon. Whether or not it was a David Unaipon invention or that of another member of the Unaipon family, there's no loan, and that patent application also lapses. So you should be able to see a very strong pattern here. Every published account of the David Unaipon patent said he failed to make money out of his inventions because his applications lapsed because he couldn't pay the fees. I think that's just plain wrong. It misunderstands the role of lodging the applications in the first place, and it suggests that his personal finances, rather than racist laws, policies, and decisions made by others, made it impossible for him to succeed as an inventor. The Aborigines Act created huge disadvantages because it removed his capacity to act like any other Australian inventor. He couldn't show around his inventions freely, he couldn't have them broadly examined, he couldn't raise interest once he'd lodged the provisional application, he couldn't raise finance, and he couldn't operate like any non-Aboriginal business person in Australia. The situation could have improved if he had the opportunity to find secure and reliable employment where he could exercise his talents, because financial security would bring other opportunities and improve his status. If he had his own income, his relationship with other entrepreneurs might have changed, and with that also the relationship with the Chief Protector whenever he was consulted. Writings were one of the mainstays that David Unaipon could rely upon, but this was always freelance periodic writing. Sometimes, as with the book published under the name of Ramsay Smith, the manuscript of which is held at the State Library of New South Wales, he was paid the growing rate. But this was unreliable income, and to produce these types of works, he also needed funds to travel and to publish. All these transactions carried additional burdens about how he could actually receive any funds, how he could pay his bills, and he needed permission to move around. Still, in the 1920s, it seemed entirely possible to create stable employment that would have suited him. But those involved really advanced their own careers and simply didn't make the effort. Through circumstances and as a consequence of racist behaviour of those he had to deal with, and many of those he needed to survive on his own terms, I think he was hugely ripped off. So why should this matter to us today? I could tell you another version of this story and leave out discussion of Aboriginality and racist Australian laws. What we don't know about, we often learn with myths. The idea that the patent system was invented is itself a dangerous myth. Patenting is a strategic project which has always been impacted because Australia has a small manufacturing sector, and it is very difficult to commercialise an invention from an Australian base. It's not simply a question of who owns the patent, but it's who's in a position to implement the technological innovation in the marketplace. In doing my research at the State Library, I went through the monthly reports of the federal patent applications from 1907 to 1970, and I also looked at the South Australian patent specifications from 1886 to 1906. In Australia, there were many shearing inventions being invented in these periods, as evidenced by quite a lot of patent filings for various equipment parts used in mechanised shearing sheds. The successful patenting strategies involve companies building up portfolios of related patents so that one manufacturer comes to dominate the industry. Capital was usually raised by floating the company on the stock exchange, usually in London, where the promoters use the existence of international patents and trademarks as assets, or at least that claims that they actually owned the important patents, in order to give the public a reason to invest in the firms. That then feeds a further cycle of expansion, buy-ups and consolidations. When you go through the records, it becomes increasingly obvious by the 1940s there are fewer and fewer patent filings by individuals and more by companies. There's a research theme to the Unaipon patents, but they are not connected to any one industry. They would not have been easy patents to commercialise except by being sold off to somebody who does see the potential early on. This is why many patent applications lapse. It's not unusual at all. Whilst this graph relates to an earlier period, it is very helpful to describe or illustrate the realities of the patenting system. The top line of this graph shows British patent applications that were filed. The descending row shows what is left in force after 3, 7, and 14 years. So, for example, in 1871, in 1871, there were 3,520 patent applications filed. There were 2,338 patents which were granted of those and that were enforced after 3 years. There are only 819 in force after 7 years, and 307 after 14 years. When you do the maths, only 9% of patent applications that were filed end up being valid for the whole term of 14 years. This is something that's important to understand, but being an Aboriginal Australian created an additional real obstacle, and I think an open and honest account of these needs to be properly incorporated into a discussion of David Unaipon's achievements and failures. David Unaipon is a really important Australian inventor, and he is an inspirational figure in many regards. His persistence with continuing his research endeavour and to communicate his understanding of the interaction between the natural and physical world, between science, technology and the lived condition is pretty extraordinary. And whilst his success was really much about him, he clearly recognised as a significant scientific figure in his own time. He was in contact with all the important civic leaders in Adelaide. He was very well connected to the Royal Society, the Adelaide Museum and the South Australian Museum, though he was not really recognised as a member of any of those organisations. He was pursued by those institutions in order that they could advance their own agendas and out of curiosity. But none of these organisations really acknowledged him, his contribution, and also, in particular, his responsibility for how his life played out. The standard stories continue to erase the realities of survival as an Aboriginal Australian. So with this project, I would argue that I think writers and Australian public institutions need to do much better and correct the record. And I hope this research provides some basis for that and to think more deeply about the legacy of this history in presenting stories of Aboriginal science and invention. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Such a wealth of information there. And I do recall you spending many hours in the reading room going through those patent reports, trolleys of volumes of work. So we do have a couple of questions that are starting to come through. You've spoken a bit this morning about some of the barriers to obtaining and then keeping a patent for its full term. Is it still that hard to do? Are those sorts of barriers still in place for everyone, and particularly for First Nations people?
Well, first of all, yes, I think that is the case. If you think of patenting as something with a single individual who produced the invention, it's really a misunderstanding how invention works and how science and technology actually progresses. But in terms of making financial benefits flow from an invention, it requires a really sophisticated financial strategy from the start. And usually it's not a question of simply commercialising an invention. A patent will actually have various different components. There could be multiple patents relating to what we might call an invention. And it's really by, in a sense, a whole of the universe approach to science and technology, to investment, to company structures, to tax, to research and development. We want to do financially well from an invention. There's no such thing as a eureka moment and then the money starts flowing in.
I don't know, I kind of like the romance of the eureka moment for some of these things that are invented, but obviously that's not the case. So were you surprised to find many? I mean, you had that graph with 10 of his patents. Were you surprised to find that many, or were you actually expecting to find more when you started looking?
So I didn't go in with any particular point of view. So there's been various studies where people have obviously looked at it before. So some accounts said he had 9, some accounts said he had 19. But actually it's really hard to search patents unless you actually are an intellectual property lawyer and actually know what you're actually looking for, because it lists it by all these different types of codes and numbers. They don't, you can't just search the name Unaipon. It doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of dedication, and it's very boring work, frankly, just going through reading month after month after month, looking for particular codes, numbers, and trying to trace them back. So I was more concerned about not making mistakes, to be honest, in going through it. And I can't obviously rule out that I haven't, but I'm pretty sure I haven't missed any on the records. But as I said, that's not necessarily how many there were for which there were inventions. And it's interesting that after 1943, there are no filings at all after Cook's death. So that suggests that his capacity to actually pursue patenting terminated when Cook died.
So the legal fees are on top of the patent fees that you mentioned?
So that's possible. I really don't know, because there's no surviving records for that I've been able to find for John Cook's firm, and I did check the big patent firms that did survive, and they have no records of it. It's unlikely, I think, that Cook was actually charging him fees. There's references in other accounts of Cook supporting other inventors as well, as a speculative type thing. So given the fact that he seems to have been quite a reliable ally as a politician, that to David Unaipon, I suspect that he wasn't actually charging him patent fees. He may have been looking for support coming out of the end, perhaps, because he would get the patent business from any commercialisation.
Yeah, so we just had a query coming through that perhaps it was a loss of pro bono support that then made the process even more prohibitive for Unaipon after Cook's passing, maybe.
What I think is more remarkable is that Cook continues to support the lodging of the patent specifications for decades and decades, even though the same thing happens over and over and over again, and they would have been following it. So I think what's more actually astounding is Cook's ongoing support, even though he obviously recognised the obstacles here. So I don't think it's a matter of a lack of pro bono support. I think it's the other structural factors which are the problem here, not that there was nobody there to help him.
Somebody's asking where this research that you've done, if it will be published or if it will be made available in other ways apart from this talk.
So I've discussed this with Kinr, who has actually seen what I was going to actually talk about it. Kim's doing his own book, and so he has copies of all of the information or primary findings that I have. And Kinr and I are looking to actually write it up as a journal article, which is my next task to do after today's talk, is to actually write it all up properly.
Okay, well, keep an eye out then for Scholar Talk news, because we do try where we can to share books and journal articles written by our fellows and visiting scholars for people who want to revisit or read more. Just looking through, we've got a couple of people, lots of people saying thank you. A couple of people were struggling with the connection today, so they are looking forward to the recording or reading what you might produce after today's talk. Somebody's asking, do you think that there's a need to change the way patents are lodged, or the term, or how that process of needing to renew? Is there something that would benefit the people who are lodging the patents, which you see as a consistent way of disadvantaging inventors without a lot of resources behind them?
No, I don't think that's a significant issue today. I mean, the patent system is an international system, and it's very much tied up with international and world trade. The bigger problem with the patent system, I think, is the way in which we valorize the idea that this is private money. That if you look behind a significant amount of invention today, there's a lot of public money and support that actually goes into supporting research and development, supporting the progress of the patent. But when it comes to the patent beneficiaries, that's kind of erased from the record, and there's this presumption that somehow this is actually a reward for the risk the private companies have actually taken. There is risk of the involved private companies, but I think there's a much broader conversation we actually need to have about the benefits. And I think with COVID, we've all seen some of the issues there, that we have, limited access worldwide to really important medical treatments and vaccines, all of which are patented generally, and patented by private companies who are controlling access to that for the global south and for others. And a lot of that research and development actually was supported by public money. And I think that there's a whole range of issues that we need to talk about there. Similarly, the patent system creates kind of perverse incentives. So it encourages research in particular areas where there's likely to be a very high financial return, and there's not necessarily a lot of incentives provided by the patent regime to actually work on other scientific problems that relate to things like managing climate change, other things like that. There's other kinds of bigger problems that we need to actually address where patents are not necessarily the answer. So I think these are larger conversations that we need to have.
This is kind of out of scope. Do you think there was global resistance to the inventions and this idea of free energy?
Don't think so, because there was an enormous amount of research into that concept that happened during this period. I mean, I've got books of American perpetual motion inventions, so-called, and patent specifications and things like that. It was a very, very big issue that people were actually investigating and had been for centuries. So I don't think there was a resistance to free energy itself. It was just that the commercial applications of it were really about modifications of existing machinery that was already in operation and in use. So it wasn't blue sky thinking that was actually likely to be progressed through things like patents in that period.
Yeah, probably would have made a few people in a few boardrooms nervous, but we won't talk about them. And somebody is asking, with your research across patents and copyright and intellectual property and all of the things that you do, what is, after you finished writing your article with Kinr, what is next for you and your next big project?
So I'm actually working on a project which is not historical at the moment, but looking at Australian universities' intellectual property policies and research policies and ways in which we can improve public benefit to the knowledge that is actually produced by the taxpayer and for the taxpayer, and ways in which we can actually make it more effective to communicate and collaborate with industry, with communities in that sector. So it's a kind of quite a practical, applied kind of research project that I'm currently engaged in.
Time consuming as well, by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
We don't have any more questions of Kathy today, and we're almost right on time. So I'd like to thank Kathy Bowrey for coming along and spending so much time at the library. It was a delight to have you in the Fellows Room, and to all of you for coming along today to celebrate this really incredible story and the ramifications that it has for patents more broadly. Please join us next time. Scott McKinnon, Nancy Keesing Fellow, will be talking about his research at the library on the decriminalisation of homosexuality, which was shockingly illegal in New South Wales until 1984. Bookings for that talk about basic human rights are open now, so I hope you can log on and book yourself a ticket, and I'll see you on Tuesday, the 2nd of August at 11 o'clock. Thanks very much. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks, Kathy.